Every year, thousands of pilots take to the skies with years of training, hundreds of hours logged, and the confidence that comes from mastering one of humanity's greatest achievements, flight. Yet, despite all this expertise, despite all the technology, despite all the safety protocols, pilots continue to die from mistakes that are completely preventable. These aren't freak accidents or mechanical failures beyond anyone's control. These are human errors, repeated over and over again, claiming lives in eerily similar ways. The most terrifying part? Many of these pilots never saw it coming. They were experienced, careful, and by all accounts, competent aviators. But in aviation, competence isn't always enough. Sometimes, all it takes is one split-second decision, one overlooked detail, one moment of confusion, and everything changes. Today, we're going to examine 5 of the most dangerous mistakes that kill more pilots than most people realize. These aren't rare occurrences or obscure scenarios. These are common, deadly traps that have claimed countless lives, and they could happen to anyone who flies. The first mistake that continues to kill pilots at an alarming rate is controlled flight into terrain, often resulting from spatial disorientation. Imagine this scenario. You're flying on a perfectly calm evening. The aircraft is performing flawlessly. All systems are green, and you're in complete control. Then, without warning, you fly straight into the ground or into the side of a mountain. This is controlled flight into terrain, and it's one of the most counterintuitive ways pilots die. The aircraft wasn't malfunctioning. The weather wasn't necessarily catastrophic, and the pilot wasn't incapacitated. Everything was under control, right up until impact. Spatial disorientation occurs when a pilot loses the ability to correctly interpret their aircraft's attitude, altitude, or airspeed in relation to the Earth. This typically happens when flying in conditions where visual references are lost, such as in clouds, fog, darkness, or even over featureless terrain like open water or snow-covered ground. Your inner ear, which your brain relies on to sense balance and orientation, can be completely fooled during flight. You might feel like you're climbing when you're actually descending. You might feel like you're flying straight and level when you're actually in a steep bank. Your body will lie to you, and if you trust what you feel instead of what your instruments are telling you, you will die. The statistics are sobering. Studies have shown that spatial disorientation is a factor in between 12 and 30% of all general aviation accidents. When visual meteorological conditions deteriorate and pilots continue into instrument meteorological conditions without proper training or currency, the average survival time is measured in minutes, not hours. Some research suggests that a pilot without instrument training who flies into clouds has an average of just 178 seconds before losing control of the aircraft. That's less than 3 minutes from the moment you enter the cloud to the moment you lose control. The tragedy is that spatial disorientation is entirely preventable. The solution is simple in theory. Trust your instruments, maintain proficiency in instrument flying, and never ever continue visual flight into instrument conditions. But in practice, pilots continue to make this mistake because overconfidence, pressure to complete a flight, and the insidious nature of disorientation itself combine to create a deadly trap. Your brain will tell you the instruments are wrong. Every fiber of your being will insist that you need to pull up or turn or dive when the instruments show something completely different. The pilots who survive are the ones who have trained themselves to ignore their instincts and trust the gauges, no matter how wrong they feel. The second deadly mistake is fuel mismanagement and fuel starvation. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? In an age where we have fuel gauges, fuel flow computers, and detailed flight planning tools, how could any pilot run out of fuel? Yet it happens with shocking regularity, and it kills pilots and passengers who had every reason to believe their flight would be routine. Fuel-related accidents account for a significant percentage of general aviation crashes, and the vast majority of these are completely preventable. These aren't cases where fuel lines ruptured or tanks mysteriously leaked. These are cases where pilots simply didn't ensure they had enough fuel for the flight, didn't properly monitor fuel consumption during flight, or made critical errors in fuel management that left their engines silent when they needed them most. There are several ways this mistake manifests. Some pilots depart with insufficient fuel for the planned flight, perhaps underestimating headwinds, overestimating ground speed, or failing to account for delays and diversions. Others fail to switch fuel tanks when required, allowing one tank to run dry while usable fuel sits in another tank. Some pilots misread fuel gauges or place too much trust in inaccurate or malfunctioning instruments. Others simply become so focused on other aspects of the flight that they forget to monitor one of the most critical resources they have. The psychology behind fuel mismanagement is fascinating and frightening. Pilots often fall into a trap called get-home-itis, where the desire to reach the destination overrides better judgment. They convince themselves they have just enough fuel to make it, that the winds won't be as bad as forecast, that they can make up time somehow. They press on when they should divert, they skip precautionary fuel stops because it would add time and inconvenience, and they rationalize away the warning signs until it's too late. When the engine finally stops, the aircraft becomes a glider with limited range and even more limited options. If you're over hostile terrain, over water, or far from suitable landing sites, your chances of survival drop dramatically. The cruel irony is that fuel management is one of the simplest aspects of flight planning and execution. Calculate your fuel requirements with appropriate reserves, verify the actual fuel quantity before departure, monitor consumption during flight, and land with the planned reserves intact. It's not complicated, it doesn't require expensive equipment or years of training, and yet pilots continue to die because they convince themselves that cutting it close would work out fine this time. The third mistake that continues to claim lives is loss of control during takeoff and landing, particularly during low-altitude maneuvering. Takeoff and landing are the most critical phases of flight, the moments when the aircraft is slow, low, and least forgiving of errors. This is when the majority of aviation accidents occur, and among these, loss of control accidents are particularly deadly. Stall spin accidents during the traffic pattern account for a disproportionate number of fatalities, often occurring when pilots attempt to turn from base to final approach, or during go-arounds and emergency maneuvers. The scenario plays out with tragic consistency. A pilot is turning from base leg to final approach and realizes they've overshot the runway center line. Instead of making a shallow turn and accepting a slightly wide approach or going around, they instinctively try to tighten the turn by adding rudder or increasing the bank angle at low airspeed. The aircraft stalls, one wing drops, and the aircraft enters a spin at an altitude too low for recovery. From the moment the pilot realizes what's happening to ground impact might be only 2 or 3 seconds. There's no time to react, no altitude to recover, no second chances. The same thing happens during go-arounds, when pilots already behind the aircraft and task saturated fail to properly manage pitch, power, and configuration. The aircraft stalls during the climb, and without sufficient altitude, recovery is impossible. These accidents are particularly tragic because they often involve skilled pilots who simply allowed the pressure of the moment to override their training. The fundamental aerodynamic principles are well understood and thoroughly taught. Every pilot learns about the relationship between angle of attack, airspeed, and stall. Every pilot practices stall recognition and recovery. Yet in the heat of the moment, when the runway is right there, when everything inside you is screaming to make this approach work, pilots abandon what they know and make control inputs that guarantee a fatal outcome. The answer is discipline and awareness. You must maintain adequate airspeed margins during all phases of flight, especially in the traffic pattern. You must resist the temptation to make aggressive control inputs at low altitude. You must be willing to go around and try again, rather than forcing an approach that isn't working. Most importantly, you must accept that maintaining coordinated flight and adequate airspeed is more important than reaching any particular point on the ground. The runway will still be there for your next approach, but if you stall and spin, you won't be. The fourth deadly mistake involves weather, specifically continuing visual flight into adverse weather conditions. Pilots call this VFR into IMC, visual flight rules, into instrument meteorological conditions, and it's one of the most common killers in general aviation. The scenario typically unfolds gradually. A pilot departs in good weather, planning a visual flight to a destination that's showing acceptable conditions. En route, the weather deteriorates. Maybe there's more cloud coverage than forecast. Maybe visibility is decreasing. Maybe there are scattered showers that are building into something more substantial. The pilot presses on, believing they can navigate around the worst of it, fly under the clouds, or make it through before conditions worsen. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the pilot finds themselves in a situation where they no longer have the visual references required to maintain control of the aircraft. This is where the first mistake we discussed, spatial disorientation, often enters the picture. Once a pilot without instrument training and currency enters clouds or loses visual reference to the horizon, the clock starts ticking. What makes this mistake so insidious is the gradual nature of the deterioration. There's rarely a clear moment when a pilot crosses from legal VFR into illegal IMC. Instead, there's a slow degradation where the pilot keeps convincing themselves that conditions ahead will be better, that they can stay visual just a little longer, that turning back or diverting would be an overreaction. By the time they realize they're in serious trouble, they're already disoriented, already in conditions that exceed their capabilities, and their options have evaporated. The statistics are unequivocal. VFR into IMC accidents have an extraordinarily high fatality rate, often exceeding 75%. When an untrained or non-current pilot loses visual reference and becomes spatially disoriented, the outcome is almost always fatal. Yet despite knowing this, despite the emphasis on weather decision-making in training, pilots continue to make this mistake because the human tendency to underestimate risk and overestimate our own abilities is powerful and persistent. The solution requires both skill and character. From a skill perspective, pilots must be proficient at reading and interpreting weather information, understanding their own limitations, and recognizing deteriorating conditions early enough to make good decisions. From a character perspective, pilots must have the courage and discipline to turn back, divert, or cancel a flight when weather isn't cooperating. This means accepting inconvenience, disappointing passengers, admitting you can't complete the mission as planned, and sometimes enduring criticism from those who don't understand aviation. But it also means staying alive. The fifth and final mistake we need to discuss is failure to maintain aircraft control during mechanical emergencies, particularly engine failures. Here's a reality that many pilots don't want to confront. When the engine stops, your primary job isn't to restart it. Your primary job is to fly the airplane. This sounds obvious, but accident investigations repeatedly show pilots who became so fixated on troubleshooting the engine failure that they forgot to maintain adequate airspeed, forgot to select an appropriate landing site, or delayed establishing the aircraft in the proper glide configuration until it was too late. Engine failures are actually quite rare in modern aviation, particularly in professionally maintained aircraft. When they do occur, they're usually survivable if the pilot executes the emergency procedure correctly. The key elements are immediate. Establish the best glide speed, select a suitable landing area within gliding distance, and execute a controlled emergency landing. Only after these critical tasks are addressed should the pilot attempt to troubleshoot and restart the engine. Yet investigators find wreckage where the aircraft stalled because the pilot was heads down in the cockpit, desperately trying to restart an engine instead of flying. They find accidents where perfectly suitable landing areas were bypassed because the pilot was fixated on making it to an airport. They find cases where pilots turned back toward the departure airport after an engine failure on takeoff, a maneuver that's killed countless pilots who didn't have sufficient altitude to complete the turn while maintaining flying speed. The human psychology behind these mistakes is understandable. When the engine stops, there's an overwhelming desire to make it start again. The silence is terrifying, the situation feels desperate, and every instinct tells you to fix what's broken. But aircraft are designed to glide, and a pilot who maintains control, selects the best available landing site, and executes a proper emergency landing, can walk away from an engine failure even in challenging terrain. The difference between survival and tragedy often comes down to priorities and discipline. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Fly the airplane first, manage the emergency second, worry about everything else third. This isn't just a catchy phrase taught in ground school. It's a survival strategy proven by decades of accident analysis. The pilots who survive mechanical emergencies are the ones who never stop flying the airplane, who maintain their composure and execute their training even when everything inside them is screaming panic. These 5 mistakes: controlled flight into terrain from spatial disorientation, fuel mismanagement, loss of control during critical phases of flight, continuing VFR into IMC, and failure to maintain aircraft control during emergencies, share common threads. They're all preventable. They all result from human decision-making rather than equipment failure. They all continue to kill pilots despite being well understood and extensively taught. The question isn't whether you know about these mistakes. If you're a pilot, you've been warned about all of them repeatedly. The question is whether you'll recognize these situations when they're happening to you, whether you'll have the discipline to make the right choice when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable, and whether you'll resist the temptation to convince yourself that just this once, it'll be fine. Because the pilots who died making these mistakes didn't think it would happen to them either. They were experienced, trained, and confident, right up until they weren't. Stay safe up there, and remember, every flight you walk away from is a success, even if it means turning back, diverting, or canceling altogether.